Rosensweig show. My name is appropriately Avrum Rosensweig, and I'm really delighted to be here today. The show, I hope, is an inspiring podcast, and the idea behind what I'm attempting to achieve here is to interview individuals who are quite fantastic, who have done amazing things with their lives. As an example, a few weeks ago, I interviewed Dr. Bradley Strauss, who is my co-host today. And of course, for all of you who have watched that show, you know that Bradley's a very big player in the coronary field. He's my heart doctor. Doesn't like when I say that, but he is. And he's a lovely human being. And further, my second guest, or really my main guest, Hillel Hulkin, who is a renowned author and translator, he and Bradley are actually very dear friends. So I thought it would be a nice thing to bring Brad on as a co-host and warm up the environment a little bit. Having two friends as part of this never hurts. So Hillel Hulkin, thank you so much for being with us and welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Evan.
Yeah. And Bradley, I want to thank you also.
Brad. Nice to be here, both of you. And Hillel, great to see you. Hopefully soon in person.
Yeah.
All right. So let's sort of break the ice here a little bit. I'm sure people are wondering, how are you guys friends? How did you initiate your friendship?
Well, Brad might be able to tell that story better than I can because it's actually a longer story on his end. But
I tracked him down.
My first book was called Letters to an American Jewish Friend. I guess I should have called it American Canadian, but that would have stretched. Might not have fit on the title page. And it was a book I wrote in the middle 70s. It was published, I think, in 76 or 7. My wife and I had moved and settled in Israel in 1970. And it was a book, it was subtitled A Zionist Polemic. And it was a book that really tried to make the argument that a Jew who took being Jewish seriously and really thought of it as something central to his life should be, if he were to be entirely honest with himself, should be living in Israel. That book went right over the heads of 99% of 6 million Americans and Canadian Jews. But one person it spoke to was Brad, who read the book. And I don't know, maybe you should say a few words now, Brad, about what the book meant to you.
Sure. I read the book in, I think, the summer of 1978, when I was just about to go into medical school, actually. And for me, the book changed the way that I saw the world, because up until then I had pretty much accepted this idea of that the diaspora had a certain role, that there was advantages to living there. And then I read the book, and he slowly, chapter by chapter, broke down all of my preconceived ideas going into it. And by the end of it, I was convinced that his stance was correct. Now, it wasn't easy for me.
Yeah, Brad was my ideal reader because he reacted to the book exactly as I hoped readers would.
Right.
So, but life circumstances were such that I could say I know he's right, but I can't really do what he's saying. And so, for many, many years, it remained in my head. And then some circumstances came where I came upon the book again, and quite unbelievable ones, where I was actually working at St. Michael's Hospital with one of my Israeli fellows, and I was telling him about the book and the impact. And as we walked into the lounge where the patients were waiting for us, and this is St. Michael's, it's, okay, nice Catholic hospital there, I looked on the bookshelf, and there on the shelf itself was the book. Just after 1 minute after telling me about
it. That someone else who didn't read it the way I hoped, who gave it away at the first episode.
I mean, there weren't a lot of copies around 40 years later, right, or 35 years later, that were fresh copies. So, and that when I saw that, I went, well, I mean, if there's signs, this got to be something.
Right.
So, and then again, there was a lapse of a number of years for various things, and at some through a mutual acquaintance, Epi, I found I was able to locate his email. And then I was like a hound. I just tracked him down and I told him, I really want to meet you. And I went with my wife up to Zikron and managed to have lunch with him. And I've been sort of seeking him out regularly on my trips to Israel ever since then. And, I just want to say that as much as I always enjoyed reading all of his books, I mean, they just span from, there's such a eclectic group of topics that he has that span the spectrum from all of them interesting, fascinating, but to actually know him personally is even better than reading him, because as an individual, it's just such a pleasure to sit with him, and it's one of my main treats when I'm in Israel, which is more and more right now. So I love to make my way to Zikron.
You may not be able to see it on video, but I'm blushing.
Yeah.
You're looking
By the
good.
way, yeah, you have lovely cheekbones, Hillel. You're a handsome man.
Mm.
I was wondering, Hillel, because you've translated well over 30 books. You've written novels, biographies. You have you really have quite a portfolio. Well done. I will tell you also that, my father was a rabbi in Kitchener, Ontario. Have you ever heard of Kitchener?
Yes, I have.
Okay, probably from Bradley, who's also
Kitchener,
from
the
there.
original Kitchener was a British general, wasn't he?
He was.
Yeah.
Yes, he was. But even more auspicious was that it used to be called Little Berlin. So there was a very, very big German population there. And I have to tell you something. I remember this book sitting on my father's desk. He should rest in peace. And I remember flipping through it at the time. So when Bradley said, "Look, I know Hillel Hulkin, and I could probably get you an interview," my mind went back there. And what I'm wondering, I'm a writer, but I'm not an author. As an author, Hillel, knowing that in 1978, which was 45, 50 years ago, there was a rabbi in Kitchener, a small city, reading your book. Does that knowledge still touch you? That way out somewhere, people are listening to your ideas.
It does, Avram. And, writing, for most writers at least, if you're not terribly famous, and to be honest, I'm not, even if you refer to me as though I were better known than I am. But writing is it's a very lonely occupation. And part of the loneliness is that you never really know who, if anyone, is reading what you've written. You can publish a magazine article, or you can publish a book. Occasionally a writer will write you. A reader will write you, and it's always very nice when that happens. But for the most part, you have no idea who is reading you. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know how they're reacting. So whenever I do get a reaction to anything I write, it's very meaningful. And sometimes, as just happened now, these reactions come 50 years later. And, I'll sometimes run into someone at some occasion or meeting, and they'll say, I read this book of yours, and also 40, 50, 30 years ago, and it spoke to me. And it's very gratifying when that happens. And it Letters to an American Jewish Friend, which, as I say, was my first book, and in some ways seems very distant for me now, but it was the book that more than any other did lead to many, many letters and many readers getting in touch with me. That happened much less with subsequent books. Part of the reason, I think, was because it really touched on a nerve with North American Jews, and part of the reason was that it itself was written in an epistolary form. It was written as a series of letters. So it invited letters in return, and many people did write.
It was a fictitious communication, wasn't it?
It was fictitious. It was written to a fictitious correspondent, but it was a correspondent who, in my mind, was a composite of several real people whom I knew. That is, I took several people and I created a single fictional individual to whom I was writing from them.
I'm just curious. When I was listening to an interview that you did with Yossi Klein Halevi, he's written a book called "Letters to a Palestinian Friend." Do you think he copied you on that?
No, I mean, Yossi certainly knew of my book, but it's not, Letters to is not an original
Right, it's
title on
not.
my part either. I think there's a fairly large number of books that consist of letters to somebody or other. The only one I've ever read, which is a wonderful little book, is Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, wrote before the First World War, wrote a book called Letters to a Young Poet. So it's a common, if you're writing a book in the form of letters, it's an obvious way to call it.
Yeah, the only reason I asked you that.
I don't think Yossi can be accused of plagiarizing a title.
No, God forbid, I wasn't saying that. But the reason I do ask you is because he said when he was growing up and reading your stuff, he felt that if he could emulate anybody as a writer, that it would be you. So I'm wondering, when writers write, I'm assuming it's almost like a tapestry of information that you bring together from different people whom you have read, and ultimately you form it into your own sort of abstract or
Yes,
otherwise.
although it's at least in my experience, one of my problems as a writer is not so much invoking other writers or associations with other writers. It's doing the opposite. It's trying to drive them away, because when you write, writing is in some ways a collective undertaking. I mean, every writer, you don't write unless you've read, and everything you've read in some sense goes into your writing. But there's always the danger that your own voice is going to be overwhelmed or drowned out, or in some ways falsified by all the other voices that you've read in your lifetime, and who end up infiltrating your own language, if you have language of your own. So it's actually, when I'm writing a book, I try very hard not to read authors whom I love. I save them for between books. When I'm writing, I don't want to read anyone who may end up, in my next sentence, inadvertently.
Your father was Abraham Holkin. He was a professor of Jewish literature, history, and culture at the JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary in America. Your mother was Shulamit. She was a daughter of Rabbi Meir Bar Ilan. Were you close with your parents? Do you have lovely memories of them?
I think the answer would have to be yes and no. Yes, I was close, but I was never really intimate with them. As I think, I don't know anyone of my generation really who was intimate with their parents, and I'm not sure that, even my own children are not, in a certain sense, intimate with me either, although we're also very close. But yes, it was a warm family. It was a loving family. They were good parents on the whole.
What was your mom like?
My mother was a social worker, and a very good one, apparently. She worked mostly with Jewish immigrants to the United States who settled in New York. And she, in many ways, had a social worker's psychology, which was very useful at times and sometimes exasperated me, because my mother was a person who thought that everything had a solution. Every problem had a practical solution, and you simply had to sit down and work it out. And so she would try to apply that to my life too. And there were many problems in my life that I either didn't think had solutions, or if they did, I didn't want her to be the one solving them. So, but she was a lovely woman, and she was a beautiful woman, and very practical. Unlike my father, who I think was somewhat more romantic and I was thinking the other day, I was actually talking to my wife about how in our own life, in our family life, although I think of myself as a fairly social person, it's she who has to make the social contact. It's my wife who has to do the inviting, who has to call people, who has to arrange meetings. And that's something I really inherited from my own family, I realized, because that was the division of labor between my father and my mother too. My father could be, a very entertaining host if there were guests at the house, and there very often were. And he was, a very good conversation partner, and he knew really how to take an interest in people. But I sometimes think that if it weren't for my mother, he would have lived like a hermit.
Right.
It was
You know,
she who did all the engineering and the organization around the social meetings that they had.
it's fascinating on both sides. You have very prominent family, amazingly prominent on your mother's side. Yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean my mother's family in some ways was much more prominent,
yeah.
but my mother comes from an old rabbinical, a very well-known rabbinical. Who put that on the screen?
that
Brad?
that was
No,
me.
but actually, I took that picture. I want you to know
That's the photograph Brad took
my picture.
of me at our first meeting in
Yeah.
Zichron Yaakov that he talked about
Oh,
But
before.
I noticed it in the
I'm
internet. Yeah,
dedicating. Brad brought the book with him that we've been talking about,
yeah,
and here I am signing a dedication to him.
oh, you're kidding. That's fantastic.
yeah.
Okay,
That
good,
is that
good.
picture.
I love that.
I think Terry, your wife, Brad, took that photo.
Yeah.
But anyway, to get back to what you were saying, Avram, my mother came from a really very distinguished line of rabbis and well-known rabbis. But I was also, I think, less identified with her side of the family than with my father's side, which didn't have as illustrious a lineage going back very far. But my father had an uncle, had a brother, my uncle Simon Halton, whom I knew well and loved, who was a well-known Hebrew poet, and there was a Yiddish poet, a cousin Shmuel Halkin, who was a very fine Yiddish poet. And I identified, I think, much more with the literary side of my family than with the rabbinical side. With the rabbinical side, to this day, it's strange because secular people, secular Israelis really don't know who these figures are. If I say to them that I'm the grandson of Rabbi Meir Bar Ilan or the great grandson of the Netziv, the Rabbi in Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was really one of the great figures in Lithuanian, Misnagdic Lithuanian 19th century Judaism. Secular Israelis look at me and they don't know who I'm talking about. If I mention it to religious Israelis, I see them looking at me and saying, and I can hear them thinking, well, what happened to you?
Right.
Because I haven't, continued that religious form of life. So in some ways, it's a lineage or yichus, as we say in Yiddish, that doesn't earn me many points. Where, as I say, I always was more identified with my father's side of the family.
Will you see your parents again?
You mean in another life?
You've written a book about Jewish mourning, bereavement, the afterlife. I'm curious, will you see them again? Yes. Yes.
I don't know. I'm embarrassed to admit that I do sometimes feel that there has to be something after death. I say embarrassed because I generally like to think of myself as a rational person, and it's not a very rational thought. But actually, it's interesting you asked because I said just a few days ago to my wife, we were talking, we're not young anymore. And I said to her, I want you to promise me that after we die that you'll look for me, just as I'm going to look for you. Does that mean that she'll find me or I'll find her? I don't know. But yes, in some very deep and very irrational part of myself, I believe there's something after death. And I could be wrong.
Yes, we all could be. Bradley.
Yeah, I'm sure you two will find each other because you're the perfect couple. Um, I like often when you've written about your uncle and the relationship. He was the head of Jewish, Jewish studies at Hebrew University, and your father, professor in medieval. And along those lines, he succeeded Klausner, who was the great uncle of Amos Oz, and you've translated some Amos Oz books,
Only one.
well, but it's an excellent one. And I it's wrote it here. What is it? I'll find it in a second. Perfect Peace. Yeah, that was you. And so you had this relationship, and you translated for him. How was there any discussion between you? I have no idea of how when you translate someone's book, whether the interactions are like between you, and especially when there's
Well,
other levels of family relationships, like such as that case.
that particular book that you mentioned, Amos Oz's Perfect Peace, was really an unusual story. It was not like most of the other translations I've done. It was a story that started out well and in some ways ended badly. But what happened, basically authors, living authors, and I must say parenthetically here, and I've written this, that I much prefer to translate dead authors because they're much easier to work with. But
Good
living
point.
authors tend to divide into two groups. I mean, there are authors who say, all right, you're the translator, this is your job, I'm not going to interfere. You do your work, and I trust you. And some of them don't even know enough English to not trust you. But some even who do know English will simply say, go ahead, I don't want to be part of this. And there are other authors, like Amos Oz, who want to be very involved in the translation. And as you can already have guessed, those are not the kind of authors I really like to work with, because as a translator, I don't like someone looking over my shoulder, and I don't like someone giving me advice. I feel basically I know what I'm doing. And I don't want or feel I need an author's criticisms or suggestions. But if that's the terms of a translation, and basically for most of my life I translated for a living. I wasn't doing this for sheer pleasure. I would really have preferred to be writing something myself, but I was translating to make a livelihood. And so when Amos Oz said that he wanted to work with me very closely on this book, I agreed. I mean, that was part of the agreement. And actually what happened was that this was in the mid-1980s, when Amos Oz was already a well-known figure in Israel, but not the iconic figure that he later became. Amos actually, when the translation was finished, he came up to our home in Zichron Yaakov. He rented a room with a neighbor of ours for a week. And for an entire week, from morning till night, we sat together and went over my translation, which meant actually that I read every sentence of it aloud to him. And then, he would often comment, and we would deal with his comments. We would negotiate. I mean, sometimes he would want the sentence to be one way, sometimes I would want it to be another way. But, and I say this isn't the kind of process I really like, but he was intelligent. I mean, he obviously is. And most of his comments were relative to the point. I mean, I agreed with some, I disagreed with others, but it was okay. We sat for a week, and he was very much a gentleman. He played with my children. He helped wash the dishes. Amos Oz was always, he was somebody who wanted very badly to be liked. And he did things that would make someone likable. The translation was finished. Amos Oz proclaimed both to me privately and in print about how pleased he was with the new Hillel Halkin's new translation of his book, and how it was a wonderful translation, etc., etc. And then the book comes out. It's published a few months later. I think Harcourt Brace was the publisher. And I pick it up and I begin to look at it. And I see that parts of it are not my translation. I mean, they're not what I had translated. You know, a translator, I mean, one thinks that a translator's job is simply you come to an original and you put it into another language, but which is true. But translators have styles, just as authors do. And when I read a translation of mine, even if I don't remember it, and this was a case where it was fairly fresh in my mind, but I know immediately if this is my language or not, because I translate as a style. If someone has tampered with my language, I can feel it, even if I don't remember what the translation was. And I picked up this book, and I could see my language had been tampered with by an editor. So I called actually the editor in New York, who I had met and knew, and I said to him, "What have you done here?" And she was a woman. She said, "Well, Amos Oz told me I could do whatever I wanted with it.
Right.
If I wanted to make changes, I should make them."
Right.
So I was furious because I had spent a week with this man in my home and was given up a week of my life, and we had really developed a certain rapport. I thought there was an understanding between us that the translation we had arrived at was the final one.
Was good.
And here he gave some editor the carte blanche to make whatever changes she wanted. So I spoke to him, and we had a very unpleasant conversation. For 20 years after that, we never talked. Eventually, we made up, not 20 years, about 10, 15 years later, we had some contact again. But I was very angry at him.
Hello.
That's the Amos Oz story.
It's a good story. I want to ask you, I'm doing an art show this week, and I've had 3 commissions. The people have asked me to paint a particular painting that has already been sold. Actually, 3 different paintings. I said, okay, fine. You know, you make your money where you can. And I'm thinking to myself, and tell me if this jives with your feelings as a translator. I'm not nearly as excited as doing the commissions as I would sitting in front of a blank canvas and a picture unfolding from my heart, from my soul, you know, through my brushwork. Is translating a particular soulful thing? Like at the end of it, when you look at it, do you say, you know, here's my baby? It might not be my story. It's almost Oz's story, but this is my translation and I feel ownership over it, or otherwise.
I think that depends, Avrum, very much on who you're translating. When you're translating a really great author, and I wouldn't put Amos Oz in that category, but if you're translating a really great author, and I have translated some, like Shalom Aleichem, like Peretz, these Yiddish translations, like Agnon, who I translated several books from the Hebrew, it's an enormous pleasure. Again, these are dead authors, and I said I like working with them, but it's an enormous pleasure to translate a great author. To translate an author who knows exactly what he's doing, and who really never or almost never makes mistakes in what they're doing. And it's like, you know, it's like being the dancing partner of a masterful dancer. Your job is to, you know, to stay in step as well as you can, which is very demanding, but it's very, very satisfying. And it also often calls for a great amount of creativity because, you know, translation often you can't translate literally. You have to come up with your own version in English of what the Hebrew or Yiddish text is doing, because it doesn't permit itself just to be mechanically rendered. And it's very, very satisfying, very exciting work. I remember when I translated Shalom Aleicham's Tevye, the Tevye story, you know, Tevye the Dairyman. It was exhilarating. I felt it was like drinking champagne all day long. It was just wonderful.
How so? What was it about it?
Because Shalom Aleichem is really a very great writer, and he's one of the few great writers who is both extraordinarily funny and deeply profound at the same time. And but you know, his jokes often cannot be translated literally, and I sometimes had to, you know, invent jokes of my own to parallel his jokes because his Yiddish jokes didn't work in English, and I had to come up with some alternative. I did something which I really, well, yes, I have admitted it, but it's most translators would be embarrassed to say this. Shalom Aleicham's Tevye doesn't really, it's, you know, it reads in many ways like a novel, but it consists of 7 or 8 separate chapters, each one of which was composed separately, and you know, they weren't all written together as a group, so they are sequential in a way. But it doesn't really have an ending. It has one chapter that begins an ending and breaks off in the middle. It has another chapter that reads like an ending, but the two parts don't connect. And I, with my great chutzpah, decided I would connect them. And I sat down and I wrote, I don't know, 2 or 3 paragraphs. I wrote them myself. And I stuck them in, you know, I spliced 2 parts of Shalom Aleichem together with what I myself wrote. Now this is, you know, professionally and from a point of view of literary credit, this is outrageous. I mean, what translator allows himself to write in the name of a great author and to make up sentences and entire paragraphs? But I did this all the time with the feeling that Shalom Aleichem would have absolutely approved of what I was doing. Because I felt by then I had developed such an understanding with him. We had such a good relationship and such a rapport that I knew that you know, he knew that I understood him and I knew that he understood me, and he would have no problem with what I did. And I did it, and to this day, my edition of Tevye the Dairyman, you look at the last part, there's a whole page there that's really my work, not Shalom Aleicham's. But I hope by readers, I hope read it as Shalom Aleichem, and I hope I did it skillfully enough that no one noticed.
Yeah. Bradley.
Yeah, I wanted to shift gears a little bit just because we could talk for many hours, but I wanted to give you a quote from something you wrote, okay? Hello? You wrote, "Our own government is in the hands of a characterless clique of men and women who have the moral authority of horse thieves, which still makes them no worse than the opposition." Now, that could have been written last week, 2 weeks ago, but actually this is from 1977. And I wanted to ask you, you know,
where did that appear, Brad?
What's that?
Where did that appear?
It's in letters.
That's in letters to
yeah. And you know, that came in the wake of the 73 war. That's the time period you write about, and sort of certain depression and just the mood of the country at that point. And I'm thinking that in the last, obviously since October 7th, has been, you know, the largest crisis since that time. And many of the issues, certainly some of the issues are somewhat similar, but there are differences. But I just wanted to start, you know, by just asking a little bit about what your thoughts are and what's gone on the last few months, and where you see this going. You know, there's many questions related to it, but particularly, you know, you can start off with the government, because I think that you could have easily have written this last week as well. So
yeah. Well, first of all, I think from my perspective, what we're living through is far worse than the Yom Kippur War. Far more anguishing, and in a way far more worrisome and frightening. You know, the Yom Kippur War was very frightening, but only in terms of the future of Israel for the first few days. I mean, because my wife and I were fairly new immigrants then. We had been in the country for 3 years when the war broke out, and I wasn't yet in the army, so I was, observing it living it as a civilian. But for the first couple of days, you could really feel, even though our leaders weren't entirely telling us the truth, but you could really feel that the country was in danger of a military defeat, and it was. And it would have been, but that was limited to the first 3 or 4 days of the war, when the country was in shock. The army quickly pulled itself together and counterattacked, and by the time a week had passed, for all the pain and the knowledge of all the deaths and injured and casualties, it was clear that we weren't going to lose this war. And as it progressed, it became clearer and clearer that we were going to win it in some form or another. So that, although when the Yom Kippur War ended, it didn't end with the jubilation of a victory. It ended because it wasn't a total victory, and the Israeli losses were very high. It ended on a note of sadness and bitterness and anger. But there was a sense that we had lived through it, gotten through this, and we had done okay. And then after the first difficult days, the country had rallied and pulled through. Today it's different. Today, this is now dragged on for months, and it still isn't clear that we're going to win it. On the contrary, with every passing day now, it seems more likely that we may not win it. And although the consequences, if we don't win this war, will not be as immediately disastrous as the consequences of not winning the Yom Kippur War, where the country was at least in temporary danger of being militarily overrun. But I think in the long run, they're at least as serious, because I think in Israel that cannot really defeat Hamas, and that cannot do to Hamas what its leaders and pledged that it would be able to do and would do, is a country that in some sense will have its spirit broken. And I'm very fearful for the future of such a country.
What would a defeat to Israel look like?
A defeat?
Yeah.
I think that a defeat to Israel would be anything less than a victory. In other words, there are wars and battles where if you fight them to a stalemate, or even when you fight them to a relative triumph where you've gotten the better of it, but it's not the end. The other side is still on its feet and is still able to fight and is still surviving. There are wars where that's not a tragedy, where that's okay. Where there have been wars like that in American history. Think of the Korean War, for instance, where America fought for 3 years, and it ended really with a stalemate. But it wasn't a disaster. But I think with Hamas, that kind of ending would be disastrous. An ending that left Hamas in power, that left it still our neighbor, as it were, on the other side of the border, that left us with the knowledge that after this organization had surprised us and butchered us and raped us and burned us and beheaded us and all the other things it did, that we could not get rid of it. I think that would be a moral disaster. Not a military disaster, but a moral one.
Hillel, what about the Achdus that we're seeing in Israel? Here in the diaspora, we're all, fixated on videos about the dancing amongst the soldiers and within the cities, people volunteering all over the place in order that, the soldiers should be able to eat, and the soldiers wearing tzitzit and tefillin. There seems to be a narrative coming out of Israel right now, which is, while the last 2 years was very divisive, that since October 7th that we've come together and that beautiful Jewish spirit is rising and is blossoming. What about that?
I think there is a sense that the country has come together. And I think that in a way, the citizenry of the country has performed magnificently, as in many ways as the army. But it's done so not with the help of its political leadership, but almost against and in confrontation with its political leadership, and in tremendous anger at its political leadership and distrust of its political leadership. And the result is that we have, this brings us back to the quote that Brad read several minutes ago. One has the feeling here of living in a wonderful country run by wretched people. And the anger in Israel, and it's anger all around. It's an anger on the left, it's anger on the right, it's anger at the anger at the government that is running this war is immense, and it will eventually spill over when the war is over or winding down. Everyone is angry today, besides being worried and scared.
Are you worried and scared?
Yes.
It's interesting because in your writings and your interviews, you express fear and hope, sort of a juxtaposition of the two. Are you equally as hopeful?
No.
Is this the first time for you?
I hope this is a passing phase. I'm not, but today my fears are much greater than my hopes, because at the moment, again, what I see happening, when I say many people, it's not as if I'm being particularly original here, but what I see happening is a country performing well under a leadership that is performing very badly. And ultimately, it's this leadership that is going to determine our fate. It's going to have to make the decisions or not make the decisions that will determine the future. And I have very little hope from the present leadership and great fear of it.
Bradley.
Yeah, and maybe something that a little more hopeful, but I'm really interested in your thoughts about this, because you become a voice of Aliyah, and for many years, certainly the voice that I hear in my head. And I look back and looked at some of your predictions from it's getting close to 50 years ago, and you did rather well on many of them. I don't know. So just give you one. So in 1975, you predicted that the demographics would change so that most of world Jewry would live in Israel. Now, at that time, that's a pretty tough thing to predict, because I looked it up. There were about 13 to 14 million Jews worldwide. In the U.S. at that time, there were 5 to 6 million. In Israel, 3 million, roughly half the population. We're now 2023. We're slowly making our way up from 14 million to almost 16 million, and yet the majority now is in Israel, 7.2 million, which is as you would have predicted. U.S. is has stayed fairly constant at 6.3 million, maybe a little bit more. And I looked at the Canadian ones, given that we're here in Canada, and the numbers from 1971 I saw were about 280,000 Jews in Canada. Now it's only about 335,000. Not much change over the years.
But Brad, if I may interrupt you for a moment, you can continue. These figures are very misleading, because a Jew in Israel is not like a Jew in America. In Israel, that's 7.2 million people whom you speak of. Whatever their opinions and whatever their commitments and whatever their feelings about being Jewish, they're Jewish in a fundamental sense. They're living in a Jewish state. They're living the destiny of a Jewish state. They're speaking a Jewish language. They're making Jewish history. When you speak of 5 or 6 million, or slightly more or less, American Jews or Canadian Jews, you're speaking of a number, probably at least half of which today are totally disaffiliated from the Jewish community. And maybe half of the other half live Jewish lives that are fairly marginally Jewish and that don't, are not really at the center of their own feelings of identity. So you're comparing apples with oranges here. It's really two different things, and the predominance of Israel in Jewish life is far greater than the statistics that you're quoting would seem to indicate.
But you did see the change in 50 years from being half the number, and and one of the other things I saw that you talked about that time, that Israel may be the wedge between American Jews, Canadian Jews, and the country. And I'm not sure that I fully appreciated that prediction until October 7th. And we are now in a very difficult time here in the diaspora, where Israel is sort of seen as the racist, colonist or colonialist entity, oppressor. That is being broadcast regularly. We're facing anti-Semitism in ways that I barely recognize where I was brought up and where I live. And even in my own hospital, I'll tell you that there is now something I can't believe. There's a WhatsApp group of Sunnybrook Jewish support circle at my hospital. 100 people already belong to it, for a safe support space to connect and decompress for Israel. So I'm wondering, these things that you did predict, do you think this is something that will translate ultimately in a renewal of Aliyah towards Israel, or will the other issues? Israel obviously has a lot of problems going on there, and maybe this will tone down here. But are we entering a different phase in terms of North American Jewish relationship with Israel?
I don't know. It's a curious thing, Brad, because on the one hand, obviously, this wave of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, which is sweeping over America and Canada today, as well as Europe, has made Jews feel uncomfortable in their own homes in America in a way that they've never felt before. It's made them, feel worried about their place there. But of course, it's also in some ways painted Israel as a much more dangerous and less welcoming place to live in than they might have wanted to think. So to a certain extent, these two things balance each other. To the best of my knowledge, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in all this, in the last three months, in this entire terrible outbreak of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel emotion and rhetoric that you have going on, Aliyah has not been mentioned hardly in American Jewish discourse. I don't see it being put on the agenda any more than it was before October 7th. I don't see that anyone is saying, well, if life has become unbearable here, we should be trying to live it in Israel. It doesn't seem to be happening. Someone asked me the other day, what is the biggest thing that American Jews could do for Israel? And my answer was, if just one prominent American Jew, one, were to get up today and say, I'm leaving America, my place is in Israel, I'm getting on the next plane, that would have an enormous effect. One, but it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. So will it happen, once this war is over, as it inevitably will be in some way or another? And will there then be an increase in Aliyah? I don't know. Because, as I say, there are opposite forces at work here.
Hillel, what really I find very compelling about your thinking, and you say this about yourself, you're a man who pursues truth right till its very ends. When you decided that you could not be both an American and a Jew, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, you are.
You said you decided that you had to give something up, and you gave up your Americanism. and you elected to take on your Jewishness, i.e., move to Israel. And I've been wondering about your position on that because I study Talmud every day. I do Daf Yomi, and Daf Yomi is a diaspora construct. It's created outside of Israel. The Jerusalem Talmud is not studied so much by most. Beautiful things have happened within the diaspora because of diaspora Judaism. And I would argue even more than that, that there is something safe about having a population of Jews outside of Israel. So is your position then every Jew should be in Israel and the Jewishness that happens within the diaspora is not comparable to the Jewishness in Israel?
Look, it's not my job to tell anyone where to live. It's what I've tried to do in letters to American Jewish Friends, and I've tried in some of my essays, is to say, look, all I can ask of you, the reader, is to be honest about your own life and honest about the conclusions you draw from your life. What you do with those conclusions is your business.
Right.
I can't force them on you. And as a matter of fact, I've said several times, Letters to an American Jewish Friend, was not written for assimilated American Jews.
Yeah.
It was written for American Jews who feel that they want to be Jewish in some way or another. And I have no problem. I had many assimilated Jewish friends in America. We still have some whom we're in touch with. I have no problem with them. I have no problem with Jewish assimilation. On the contrary, as a Zionist, assimilation in the 20th century and modern 21st century and modern times in democratic Western society seems to me inevitable and unstoppable. And I certainly would not, oppose an unstoppable force. I'm not that foolish. So that if a Jew comes to me and says, I don't want to live Jewishly, I don't want to be a Jew in America, my answer is fine. From my point of view, if you don't want to, there's no reason why you should be. But if someone comes to me, I want, being Jewish is, and says being Jewish is very important to me, it's central to my life, then I would say, well, it would be more meaningful if you lived in Israel. Look, of course, Judaism for the last 2,000 years or so has been largely a diaspora Judaism. And it's created some great monuments. I mean, as well as some terrible predicaments for the Jewish people. I think that one of the things that really classical Zionism was able to do, which today in our sentimental form of contemporary Zionism we no longer do. Classical Zionism was able to be almost ruthlessly honest about the Jewish past. It was able to say, look, we have not been such a wonderful people. We do not have such a wonderful history. We have a history with many accomplishments and with many, many failures. And we, in a way, have lived a distorted life and an unreal life and a life that was lived to great extent in fantasy. And we need a country of our own to cure ourselves of these things. Zionism no longer talks in this language because it's for many reasons. But so yes, of course, you study your Daf Yomi and your Jerusalem, your Babylonian Talmud, just as of course many Jews in Israel did. But this is a creation of a past historical period, which in any case no longer exists today. If you look at Jewish life today, let's look at 20th century Jewish life. It's real to the extent that there has really been enormous Jewish creativity in the 20th century, and there has been. It's all been outside of the Jewish realm, really. It's been Jews writing world-class literature, Jews creating world-class music, Jews creating world-class art. But if you look at these writers or musicians, or if you look at the the Saul Bellows or the Marc Chagall's or the Gustav Mahler's, these are not people who are really contributing to Judaism, to Jewish knowledge, to Jewish continuity, to the Jewish community. They're making a great contribution to the world, as Jews often, but not to Jewish life itself. If you look at Jewish creativity within the Jewish domain in the 20th century, it's pitifully sparse, I think. Look at American Jews. What really Jewishly have American Jews created? They've created wonderful organizational structures, schools and educational systems and universities and departments of Jewish studies and Jewish summer camps and so on. But if you look at the intellectual content, the cultural content, it's all feeding off the past. You don't find anything in 20th century American Jewish life that is comparable to Jewish life in the past, where Jews were creating their own literature, their own ideas, their own structures. It's all that creativity has shifted to Israel. And I think will be even more the case in the future. And, Israel is the only place in the world, and this is a cliche, but it's true, where Jews are totally responsible for every aspect of their lives. Because in the diaspora, they're not. And I think that in that sense, it's the only place where Judaism and Jews are really being put to the ultimate tests of existence today. I say this in one of my essays in A Complicated Jew. Judaism has always said, we are a superior religion. We have our halacha, which is the wise, lays down the wisest rules for living and the wisest precepts for living. We have the greatest sages. Unfortunately, we've never had the ability to put much of this into practice because the Gentiles have always ruled the world. If we were to rule the world, we'd do so much better because we have the Torah and we have all our wisdom. And when in a messianic age, that will be the case because then the world will be ruled by our precepts. Then along comes the Jewish state. And finally, we have a chance to put all our precepts and all our wisdom and all our grandeur as a religion into practice. And you know what? The results aren't so great. They really aren't so great. They're impressive in some ways. They're dismal in other ways. On the whole, it's a very mixed bag. So what does that say about 2,000 years of diaspora Judaism? Well, in my opinion, it says partly that for 2,000 years, we were people living with fantasies. We were people who had the great advantage of not having to do many of the things that were done for them by Gentiles, including fighting the wars that defended their countries, and many other, policing the streets that defended their homes, and many other unpleasant tasks. So it was very easy for Jews to dream and fantasize about how wonderful everything would be if it was run by Jewish principles. And that's, I think, why many Jews basically cling to the idea of the diaspora to this day. Because by clinging to a certain concept of Jewish powerlessness, you're not only enabling yourself always to be the victim and never the victimizer, which is what large number of American Jews want to be, think of themselves as, or as the friends of victims rather than the victimizers. But you're also evading responsibility. Sure, terrible things are being done in Vietnam, but it's not us, the Jewish community, that's dropping the bomb on Vietnamese villages. Sure, terrible things are being done in Iraq, but it's not my synagogue that's bombing Mosul or Fallujah. It's them. It's them. It's not me. It's not us. Well, in Israel, it's us, because there isn't any them. It's us. But that really makes you think. If that's us, perhaps it's who we've always been. We just never put to the test. And Israel puts it.
I think Alevi's
right. Jews don't want to take that test. They want to go on living, in fantasy land without ever being tested.
Are you well liked in Israel?
I'm not a known author in Israel.
Right.
Again, as I said before, I'm not particularly renowned in America either. But there are, within a small circle of American Jewish readers or intellectuals, they know who I am. In Israel, that's not the case, because I've written practically everything I've written has been in English, which I have regrets about, but that's been the case. So if you ask I'm well liked in Israel, I would say, yeah, my friends, people who know me like me well enough.
And your wife, I'm sure. You're writing a Hebrew novel now. Aren't you writing a Hebrew novel now?
I'm writing a Hebrew novel now. The first time I really tried to write something long and serious in Hebrew.
You know what I found very interesting? You said that your mother tongue is your mother tongue. So when you write in English, there's something about that resonates with your soul. You're very good at Israel. You said your faculties as speaking Hebrew is equally as good as English, but it's not your mother tongue.
That's true, Avrum. But you know what's in my case, so certainly English is my mother tongue in a way that Hebrew isn't. But Hebrew was a language in my life from a very early age.
Yeah.
I can remember before I even went to school at the age of 5 or 6, my father bringing home my first Hebrew reader and giving it to me as a present. I can remember how disappointed I was, because they thought he was going to unwrap a toy. And what he unwrapped was this book in strange letters. It was called Reshis Das. I don't know.
It was a Slavic book, wasn't it?
It was a Hebrew primer. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Hebrew was there from a young age, and being Jewish was there from a young age, and Israel was there from a young age. And I went to intensive Jewish schooling. I went to Hebrew-speaking summer camps, Zionist Hebrew-speaking summer camps. So, in a way, Hebrew is almost a mother language. It's not quite, but it's almost. And I think one of the reasons that moving to Israel in general and settling in Israel was relatively very easy for me was because, one of the great sorrows of immigration is that you give up your childhood. When you leave a country that you grew up in, you move to another country, you're leaving your whole childhood behind.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, in some ways, coming to Israel was getting back my childhood. Mm-hmm. It was getting back parts of my own past that I could, no longer live in America, but I was now living in Israel. So I would say the same thing about Hebrew. Yes, there are moments. I mean, I'm writing in Hebrew. There are moments when I'm looking for a word that comes to me naturally in English and it doesn't come to me in Hebrew. Although, by the way, there's a lot of English dialogue in this book because the characters are, although the novel is in Hebrew, but it's taking place in America in 1949, and many of the characters are speaking English to each other. So there's a lot of English too. But the Hebrew comes from a deep enough inner place in me that I don't feel I'm abandoning my deepest self.
Bradley, we're going to wrap up shortly. You have a final question?
Yeah, maybe something we haven't touched on, but just to ask you about the B'nai Menashe, which I think is a fascinating part of your life that you've dedicated a lot of effort to that group. What's happening with them right now, and what do you see the future with them?
Well, we need another hour to talk about that. But what's happening again? The B'nai Menashe community is split. Really, it's half now in Israel, about 5,000, and there's another 5,000 still left left behind in India and waiting for Aliyah, which isn't coming, and at the moment. And the war has affected them both. But I think in very different ways. I think for the Bnei Menashe in Israel, this war has been I wouldn't say positive experience, or it has been in some ways, but it's been a very integrative experience. There are hundreds of young Bnei Menashe fighting in the army now. They're on the front line. Several have been wounded. I don't think there have been any deaths, but there have been several wounded in action. It's the first time that the Bnei Menashe community in Israel, I think, feels fully Israeli and feels that it's giving to Israel, to its country, and not just, taking from it in terms of all the assistance that new immigrants, and particularly new immigrants from poor countries, expect and want to get from a country. And I think the Bnei Menashe community in Israel will come out of this war feeling fully Israeli in a way that it did not go into the war as. In India, it's a different situation, because in India, the Bnei Menashe have had a war of their own. I mean, there's in the northeast Indian states of Mizoram and Manipur, where they live, there's been severe ethnic violence in the last year or so, involving the ethnic group to which they belong with other ethnic groups. And hundreds of them have been displaced, impoverished, homeless. The community there is living under great duress. And this is precisely the time when they should be coming to Israel. All of them, they all want to come. But because of the war, and because Israel is concentrated on other things and is not willing to give them the attention that their Aliyah demands, they're stuck there right now, and they're not coming. And their situation is not a good one.
Hillel, in conclusion, my question to you is, I find that you have a swashbuckling spirit to you. I'm not surprised you didn't become an accountant. Nothing wrong with being an accountant. I'm not surprised that you don't spend a lot of your time on year-end statements, because when I went through the books that you have written and or translated, I came across such books on Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, born in the 11th century, one of the greatest Jewish poets ever, wrote 800 poems, some of which you have translated in a book that you wrote. I was fascinated by your understanding and your knowledge of sort of the iambic pentameter of the age. But to me, mostly, I'm thinking as a writer, as a translator, your mind, while it's in Zichron, I can only imagine that your spirit is in Egypt, where Yehuda Halevi spent some time, or it was in Spain, where he came from originally. And it said that he actually made Aliyah, and he was in Israel his last year. I can only imagine that when you write about Tevye, Shalom Aleicham's book, that you were in Poland. Your spirit was. Your inner life must be fascinating. It must be so exciting to be inside that head and spirit of yours, because of all the places you've gone in our planet. And I would even argue outside of our planet, Is that, am I correct about that? Is that the case?
Well, my inner life is, as you said, as I've said, is complicated. Unfortunately, I can't let you into it, just as you can't let me into your inner life. But
hence the complicated Jew.
And there might be aspects of it that you would find surprising. There are aspects of it that I haven't really ever written about. Some of them I'm trying to write about in this Hebrew novel for the first time. Having an inner life is a full-time job.
It is. It is. But were you with Yehuda Halevi when you were writing, translating his book? Were you with him?
Yes, I think. No, absolutely. I think that ability to imagine yourself in another, as another person, or in another existence, it's very much part of a writer's job and a writer's gifts. In translating, I've often find myself translating books I love, I'd often find myself acting, when there's dialogue, acting it out to myself.
Yes. Yes, I
Saying
get
lines
that.
out loud, pretending that I'm the different characters.
Yes.
Asking myself does this translated phrase, is this the way this character would really speak? No, it's not. It doesn't sound right. I have to say it differently. So yes, you're constantly putting yourself in other people's places, and you do that when you write fiction too. You become other people for temporarily. Sure.
So by and large, at 85, I believe you are. Are you
84
mabsut?
and a half. 84 and a half. Let's not exaggerate.
Okay. Mazal tov, another half a year from now. Are you mabsut? Are you a satisfied man? Are you a happy man?
Not entirely. I look back on those 84 years, and I know I've done a lot, but I can't help wishing I'd done more. I
Yes,
can't help
exactly.
wishing I had done many things that I never did get to do. When people of my age, or even somewhat younger, say, "Oh, I look back on my life and I have no regrets," I never quite can believe it.
I don't either.
I'm full of regrets, full of them. I mean, as I say, alongside, there are many things that I'm very happy about. But do I feel that I've entirely lived the life I should have, or could have, or would have liked to? No, I can't say that.
I have to tell you, I really love talking with you. I really did. Thank you.
It's been fun.
You have a beautiful spirit. You
Yeah.
really do.
Thanks, Ella.
Okay.
I'll see you soon.
Yeah, Bradley, thank you.
Especially you, Brad.
Brad, you
Thank
ask
you,
you're a doctor, you're a heart doctor, but you ask some very good questions. You could be a journalist if it doesn't work out in the
I
hospital.
was a journalist at times in my life. I worked as a journalist.
Hell, I know you were, but I thought Bradley asked very good questions.
Brad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, kol hakavod to both of you. Thank you for
Okay.
doing this. I really, really
Good
enjoyed
night.
it. And Hillel,
And,
I, God willing, when I come to Israel, I would love to have dinner with you and your lovely wife.
Absolutely. Get
I
in touch.
so enjoyed it.
We'll sit down, the three of us, and have a drink together.
And Hillel, thank you so much for what you've done for the Jewish people. I was thinking, are you a mirror of the Jewish people? Are you a voice of the Jewish people? I think you're all of the above. And I just think we're all very grateful for what you've done for us. So thank you. Thank you. You've been listening to the Avrum Rosensweig Show. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a show about really fascinating people, and I think the show showed that today. Please join us next week. We're going to do some very interesting stuff. We're going to have some philosophers on, and we're going to speak in the philosopher sprach, where nobody understands what they're saying, but then we're going to dummy it down to make philosophy accessible to everybody. So have a listen. We got some great stuff coming up. Kol hakavod to my guest tonight, my co-host, and Am Yisrael Chai. God willing, peace should be around the corner, and everybody should be well. This show was dedicated to the brave mother and fathers and the grandparents in Israel, to the Chayalim and to the Chayalot, and also, of course, to the hostages. God willing, they should be released as soon as today. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to being with you again. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you so much.